Tonight on The ReidOut.
Will you accept the results of your election in November?
I'm going to win the election, and I will accept that result.
If you lose, will you accept that?
I'm going to win the election, and I will accept that result.
Arizona's Kari Lake is just one of hundreds of Republican election deniers on the ballot this fall, which is why this election, and more importantly, the day after the election, are so incredibly important. Plus, Congressman Eric Swalwell joins me with an exclusive sneak peek at a chilling new ad depicting the awful possibilities of a post-Roe America. And later, the origin of the once broadly inspiring word woke and how it's been co-opted by the right to be used as an epithet. We begin tonight with just 3 weeks to go until the midterm elections on November 8th. But it's the day after the election that I want you to focus on. Just imagine waking up on November 9th and not knowing which party will control the House or the Senate or some key state offices. Imagine it taking weeks to finish counting all the absentee and military votes in states like California, where it literally does sometimes take weeks. So what we think is the result on election night changes, just like in 2020. Or imagine that there are lawsuits by the declared losers or fake audits, leaving lots of results in limbo. The delayed tallies actually are not unusual at all. They are literally how elections work. But these are anything but usual times, because Donald Trump is now the model for how lots of Republican candidates are likely to respond. In 2020, Trump's relentless claims that the election was stolen took our democracy to the brink. And now a majority of Republican candidates on the ballot, nearly 300 of them, echo that big lie. How are they going to respond if it takes a while to count the votes? In 2020, you had people who threatened election workers as ballots were being counted. And there were already threats against election wars going into this election, to the point where precincts are being equipped with panic buttons for poll workers and vote counters to use. So what happens if some of these Republican candidates lose? We got a preview from Arizona Republican Senate candidate Blake Masters, who is already claiming in advance that the election will be stolen because the state is using the same voting machines as it did in 2020. So, of course, rigged. Also in Arizona, the Republican gubernatorial candidate, Kari Lake, says the only way she will accept the results of the election is if she wins, which is what Trump said in 2020. And they're not alone. Last month, the Washington Post questioned 19 Republican candidates in key battleground states, and a dozen of them declined to answer or refused to commit to accepting the results. And we've all seen what happened when Donald Trump defied reality in 2020. What could happen if these candidates refuse to concede in races all across this country? Right now, in the nation's capital, 5 members of the extreme right-wing group, the Oath Keepers, are on trial for seditious conspiracy tied to their role in the January 6th attack, which again was a physical war waged against the fact of Trump losing the election. The Oath Keepers, along with other extremist groups like the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters, they've got members throughout the country standing back and standing by, awaiting their next orders to be posted on Truth Social or 8chan or Gab. Our democracy is still in critical condition from the last election. So the question is, can it survive another round of attacks? I'm joined now by Barbara McQuade, former U.S. attorney and law professor at the University of Michigan, and Tim Miller, writer at large for The Bulwark. Thank you both for being here. I want to read a New York Times headline, Barb, and get your take on it. And this is what the New York Times writes. In the 2 years since 2020, groups of right-wing activists have banded together, spreading false claims of widespread election fraud or misconduct. Now those activists are inserting themselves in the vote count with a broad and aggressive effort to monitor voting in search of evidence that confirms their theories. Many activists have been mobilized by some of the same people who tried to overturn Trump's election in 2020. You have groups like Truth Social that are like, we want to make voting feel like you're being followed by the police. You've got Ron DeSantis activating the nation's only election police and already bragging about arresting people. These vibes to me, Barb, feel like they're setting up to do what Trump did, but literally nationwide. How concerned are you about the same kind of threat?
I'm very concerned, Joy. I'm concerned about the lack of legitimacy after the election, but I'm also concerned about the effect this kind of behavior can have on voter turnout. It could indeed suppress the voter turnout. If you are fearful that there is an election police that's going to be at your polling place, you may choose to stay home. Or it could cause just the kind of cynicism of people not knowing what to believe. These elections are rigged or they're not going to be fair anyway. And so people might just stay home and not come out and vote. And so all of those scenarios are very bad for democracy. So I think it's very concerning. And it is a state of where we've come in America, that if you don't like the outcome of an election, then just lie about it and say that you won. It's a terrible thing for a country that believes in self-government.
You know, and Tim, it's interesting. I mean, I think you can go back to 2000, you know, and there were a lot of people who said, not my president, about George W. Bush, right? After he, you know, lost the popular vote and won the election. Like, our system builds in this possibility that you can lose the popular vote and still be elected, which is itself problematic for continuing people's faith in democracy. But in the last 20 years, you've gone from that and people questioning the results in 2000 to people literally saying, Joe Biden is a hologram. He's not really the president. He's propped up in the basement of the White House. Trump is really the president. And literally willing to fight and kill to establish that as the real facts, when that's the facts in their head. And so I wonder if you, as somebody who used to be about reforming the Republican Party, are you concerned? Because I honestly cannot envision any of these Republicans doing a speech that, like John McCain did when he lost to Barack Obama.
Yeah, a lot there, Joy. Or Al Gore, excuse me, in 2000.
Or Al Gore, yes.
Think about my childhood. I think about those sore loserman bumper stickers that used to be on, to play on Gore Lieberman. And you know, those that was like Republicans back then, proto-lib owning, like dunking on the Democrats. Oh, you get, or you're such sore losers. But in reality, compared to what is happening now, you couldn't have lost in a more dignified manner than Al Gore did in 2000. An actual close election. Donald Trump got killed. He lost, you know, there were 4 states that needed to flip for Donald Trump to win. It wasn't a particularly close election. And yet still, you know, we saw what we saw on January 6th. So, look, I do think that the difference between then and now is extremely dramatic. And I'm concerned. I think that there are certain places where Republicans will talk a big game. We saw this with Larry Elder in California last year. He talked a big game without not accepting the results, and then he didn't follow through. Not everybody is as demented as Trump in being able to pull off something like this. But I do worry about certain places in particular, and you just showed Arizona, I think, is a prime spot. Kari Lake does seem like she has the Trumpian ability to just deny reality and be forceful about it. And you know, we saw, and I worry not just about the turnout, like Barb says, but about the safety of election workers in places like Arizona, where these kind of threats are already happening in the lead up to the election. And I think that we probably will not know on election night, at least one of those 2 or 3 important Arizona elections, Senate, Governor, and Secretary of State. And so then we will have this period, you know, like we did in 2020, of a couple of days where things will be unknown. You know, you can imagine mobs assembling outside of voting places where they're doing the counting or the recounting, taking in the absentee ballots. So I think that's something to be concerned about. And the fact that no one is speaking up about Kari Lake, I mean, even the quote unquote good Republican Glenn Youngkin is campaigning for her this week. Right? There's nobody that is, even back in the Trump era, at least we're a handful of us that were saying, no, this is wrong. No one is saying that now. And I think that's a very bad trajectory.
Yeah, and Glenn Youngkin is like a book banner, so it's like I don't even know if he's the good Republican. But I mean, the thing is, Barb, on that point, you know, the great Steve Kornacki, you know, when we sit and talk about, you know, sort of what's going to happen in elections, he's the guy who sort of explains the mechanics of these things. California is a slow counting state, so we literally might go into election night not knowing who's going to, for instance, control the House, because there are so many congressional seats in California. Let's say they take a long time to count them. You could literally think one thing on election night about who's going to control the Senate. Let's say it looks like the Republicans are going to assume control. And then 2 weeks later, when California finishes counting all its ballots, the Democrats control the House. There's nothing illegal or nefarious about that, because that's just actually the time it takes to count votes. But you have a whole slate in Arizona, a whole slate of them, who are all running as election deniers together as a ticket. You have people like Masters and you have people like Mastriano in Pennsylvania, who are all primed to take that scenario, which is literally the scenario that Trump faced, and say, see that? Democracy is a lie. This election was a lie. We won. And then how do you stop mini insurrections across the country? We already saw people get close to violent in Arizona last time. This is what I worry about, is that it'll get violent in multiple states at the same time. Are you worried about that?
I am, Joy, and it's very destabilizing for not only our democracy, but our national security. You know, we are held up as a beacon around the world as a model for democracy. And when our elections become dysfunctional, other nations point to that and they mock us, and it makes it harder for us to spread democracy around the world. If we had responsible leadership, leaders would be saying right now, look, folks, we've got to be patient. It may take a while for election results to come in. And it's different from the way it used to be. Yes, it used to be that we knew on election night. That's because we did a lot less voting by mail and allowing more access to polling places. This is the new reality, and this is good for democracy. It just takes a little longer to know the results. Instead, we have people saying just the opposite. You know, we were leading early, and then suddenly it flipped very suspiciously. There's a reason for that. But that is the message that they are exploiting to seize power and just to sow chaos. There will be some who believe an election was stolen, and those who will say an election was stolen, even they don't believe it, because they just want to cling to power and grab power. And there are people who will believe them and help them to make it so.